NTV Television Network presents The Other Day, Current Era, 1989. Translation and voiceover by BMI Russian. Good evening and welcome to episode 29 of our show The Other Day, 1961 to 1991, Current Era. Events, people and occurrences that defined a lifestyle. Things you can't imagine us without, let alone comprehend. Another year, another episode. And today we'll be reviewing 1989. Stonewashed, jeans, we leave Afghanistan, Chumak and Kashpirovsky, the events in Tbilisi, Eskrava Izaura, demolishing the Berlin Wall, stamps to buy sugar, Shemyakin and Neizvestny, the Czechoslovakian Velvet Revolution, keep your chins up, naval cadets. With commentary by actress Tatiana Drubich, economic expert Yegor Gaidar, political expert Sergei Karaganov. I never knew it could be like this. Thank you. Artem Tarasov was the first Soviet millionaire who admitted to it publicly and voluntarily. An even bigger claim to fame for him would become the many millions he never received and party membership fees that somebody else paid for him. That year, rumor had it that cooperators would be issued no more than 100 rubles a day in cash. Tarasov, who was chairman of a cooperative called Technicom, withdrew 7 million from his account to pay salaries to 4 people. His companion Pisarenko, who acquired 3 million, brought over to his party organization, where 300 rubles a month was considered good pay, his fee for January, 90,000 rubles that he was carrying in a 15-pound envelope. The cooperative was immediately raided, though a 5-month examination found no violations of the law. Tarasov claimed that they'd lost hundreds of millions and filed a lawsuit. Tarasov, who was a media darling, explained that he was an honest millionaire and that other cooperators were hiding their earnings, that the main concern should be not earned millions but lost millions. The Technica cooperative received collaboration offers from all over the country. Tarasov founded the first private foreign trade organization called Istok, which put an end to the state monopoly. The following year, he would become the only entrepreneur among legislators. Conducts a search for the appropriate trade deal for one of our Moscow-based clients. Despite our love for American cinema, we always found movies from India much closer to our hearts. And in the same vein, Forsyth sagas and other similar TV series, though successful, weren't nearly as popular as what came out of Latin America. In 1989, Central Television airs the final episodes of the Passionate Region's first soap opera, Eskrava Izaura. From then on, land plots in the Soviet Union would generally start to be called haciendas. Lucelia Santos as Izaura, directed by Herval Rosano. Episode 1. You got lucky, girl, because you're a slave girl with dark skin. You know your place. The big television executives, who were completely out of touch with normal people, agreed to air the first 5 episodes as an experiment, and they were a massive success. Even without any ratings, it was clear that stories about Cinderellas and rich men, about evildoers and simple girls, were hugely popular. We'll be seeing each other often from now on. Surely you're aware that I'm going to be living here. Excuse me. Soap operas were now a staple of TV schedules. They ushered in the era of rating-focused Russian television, where instead of showing what gets the least criticism, you air what's enjoyed by the majority of the people. This was the first ever super TV series in Russian history. A bit of help from Brazil, for all of the Soviet housewives stuck doing everyday chores. In 1989, you were busy making a living, but in the evening you had the opportunity to immerse yourself into that sweet imaginary Brazilian world. Turns out that Russian people, women in particular, sympathized with Latin America. Their fervor, openness, sincerity, faith in the element of chance, their attitude towards fate. We were more into Latin American popular culture than Hollywood TV series.
Iskrava Izaura supplanted great Indian cinema. The more absurd, the more preposterous the on-screen image is from an art's perspective, the more accurate and compassionate of an impact it makes on the viewers. Iskrava Izaura was like anesthesia. It was a therapy session for the entire country during those final difficult years under socialism.
In 1989, when a group of activists began collecting signatures in support of building a monument to honor the victims of Stalin-era repressions, its leaders were apprehended by the KGB. By January of 1989, when Memorial Society's inaugural Congress was summoned, they already had 50,000 signatures, plus they had Gorbachev's support. They were referred to as a historical outreach society. Authorities were not eager to grant them a license, and were especially annoyed when they went out looking for grave sites. Despite the resistance, they were able to put up a monument on Dzerzhinsky Square next to KGB headquarters in honor of this agency's victims, in the form of a huge boulder from the Solovki. A deep-sea submarine called Komsomolets sinks to the bottom of the Norwegian Sea. A fire broke out in the engineering compartment on day 39 of autonomous navigation. They were unable to put the fire out underwater, and despite emergency resurfacing, out of 69 crew members, 42 were killed. 255 pounds of radioactive uranium sank to the sea floor, together with 13 pounds of plutonium-239. This enormous nuclear submarine was able to dive to a record depth, over 3,300 feet. Nobody doubted the reliability of the vessel. A Norwegian military patrol plane was the first to see the submarine resurface while releasing plumes of smoke. The Norwegians later claimed that if they were contacted for assistance, they would have made it to the scene much quicker than our own ships did. The Komsomolets went down after 6 hours. Life rafts were dropped into the water, but they opened upside down. The majority of the seamen froze to death in those icy waters. When everything was permeated with pluralism, the entire country shared the opinion that if Gorbachev were to put an end to the war in Afghanistan, that alone would earn him a statue in his lifetime. At the time, things did appear to be headed in that direction. But even after the Geneva Accords on Afghanistan were signed in April of 1988, not many believed the troops would be withdrawn before the deadline. As late as December, the Soviet Union warned the US and Pakistan that failure to uphold the accords could lead our troops to stick around. However, right on time, on February 15, 1989, the last convoy of armored vehicles went over the bridge near Termez in Uzbekistan and crossed the Soviet border. Lasting twice as long as the Great Patriotic War, the war in Afghanistan had been lost. The Mujahideen prevailed, and we were unable to secure the reign of a friendly regime. Najibullah, the last of the Kremlin's protégés, wasn't in control of the entire country, even with help from our 40th Army. It was obvious that Najibullah would be overthrown as soon as we left. In mid-January, Shevardnadze flew into Kabul, though he only promised to aid with fuel and produce. On January 31st, General Gromov, commander of the 40th Army, assured that our troops would leave Afghanistan before the deadline. In order to leave, they had to go through the Kabul blockade. Soviet planes were bombing the area near the Salang Pass. For the first time, the Soviet Foreign Affairs Department expresses regret on account of innocent civilians being killed, while placing the blame onto Afghanistan's opposition. Realizing that after the Russians' departure, Kabul would fall and be occupied by the Mujahideen, foreign embassies began evacuation from the capital city. The last Afghani settlement that our troops had to pass before they could get home was Hayratan. On the opposite side of the Amu Darya was the city of Termez in Uzbekistan. The Soviet Union received requests from all former heads of Afghanistan to build a bridge across the river Amu Darya, including Daoud, Muhammad Taraki, and our answer was always that this was impossible, with it being hard to even set up pontoons on such a river. This bridge and a few more pontoon bridges were built immediately once we deployed our troops. This one was called the Friendship Bridge. Our men were given their final orders on Afghanistan soil. The convoy is approaching the border. The war is finally over. General Gromov made a promise while still at war that upon crossing the border, he'd turn around while standing on the bridge, look towards Afghanistan, and say his piece. On February 15, 1989, he did just that. By his own account, his words did not look good on paper. Here's what he said into the microphone. "All soldiers and officers who made it through this hell deserve their own statues. There is not a single active member of the 40th Army left behind me. There is not a single Soviet soldier, ensign, or officer left behind. This marks the end of our 9-year campaign." One more thing I'd like to say. Our soldiers who made it through these 9 years, I think they deserve their own statues. On the other side, our troops waited to be greeted by Uzbekistan's Party Central Committee and to receive telegraph blanks in order to send telegrams back home saying we're out. Later on in Russian commissariats and executive committees, they'd start hearing, "I'm not the one who sent you to Afghanistan." Afghan war syndrome was much discussed in the media, as well as veterans' need for rehab, and how similar they were to Americans who fought in Vietnam. Afghan veterans had a song, "Goodbye to the Mountains." They're more aware of who we were in this distant land. Hopefully, when judging us, the paper pushers try to understand. The super popular band Nautilus Pompilius released a ballad in the same vein. My brother Cain traveled to a remote country, where he protected the children of the Prophet. My brother Cain is back in Russia to save us from the Masons and fate. He's waving his arms trying to catch evil spirits while hitting us instead. My brother Cain will be the undoing of us all after losing his eyesight. The latest massive jean-related fashion trend. The fresh-looking sort was out, faded ones were in. Or boiled, rather. Genuine jeans of this type were given a special name, stonewashed, which never caught on. The most popular of the mass-produced jeans were Malvina from Poland. Meanwhile, a bunch of people were making their own custom jeans. When boiling at home, you had to twist your pants or your jacket and cook them in a tub with bleach or chlorine, all the while without flipping or stirring. There were certain recipes that involved tying knots. The return of Alexander Solzhenitsyn began with his books. In 1989, Novy Mir publishes selected chapters from his novel The Gulag Archipelago. They even admitted Solzhenitsyn back into the Writers' Union. The Secretariat was still full of those who ousted him and approved his deportation from the USSR, but the decision was unanimous. The author insisted they first publish the fictitious account on the Chief Prison Camp Administration Inventory, this literary anti-Soviet manifesto. The Gulag Archipelago's release was the peak of socialistic pluralism in the USSR. Stalin was no longer the main villain, instead merely carefully following in Lenin's footsteps. This marked the downfall of the last Soviet cult left standing. For the first time, the public speculated on whether the right historic choice was made back in 1917. Two new superstars emerge, Alan Chumak and Anatoly Kashpirovsky. In 1989, these two psychics were the most trusted people in the country. The word, coined by the literary newspaper, quickly became common. To kids and adults, healthy and sick, these TV sessions hosted by Chumak and Kashpirovsky appeared to be a blending of shows such as Health and Come Fairy Tale. Skeptics referred to the duo as Chuvak and Nightmarovsky. The gray-haired magician Alan was a former cyclist and journalist. Every morning, his silent head would appear during the show 120 Minutes. After explaining restoration of biological fields, Chumak would proceed to make mysterious hand gestures. He claimed to ease pain with his hands, charge water, and creams. Viewers would place jars and tubes next to their TV screens. Anatoly Kashpirovsky was a therapist by trade. First Vzгляд showed him relieving a surgery patient's pain telepathically without even being in the room. And then on primetime television, they aired his health promotion meets from Ostankino studios. Kashpirovsky hypnotized a massive audience while sending the country into an even deeper state of trance. Many of you will be relieved of various spasms and irritation. Those who tend to be anxious by nature and who are looking on right now in tension while firmly gripping their seats, just sit back and smile, no need to be tense, relax. If you wish, you can even go ahead and pour yourself some tea. During his sessions, people in the audience and at home would swing their heads, wave their hands, laugh and cry. Kashpirovsky programmed people to cure them of all ailments, but judging by the telegrams that were read out loud in the studio, what the healer was best at was, quote, activating internal alarm clocks within those suffering from enuresis and dissolving scar tissue. Speak up. Talking to the microphone. What did you want to say or ask?
Thank you, Mr. Kashpirovsky. My alarm clock works fine.
Let me give you a kiss. Go on. The experts were up in arms. Nowhere in the world did therapists get airtime, healing with no feedback was unacceptable. The televised experiments were ceased, but there was still a shortage of faith and medicine. Kashpirovsky was touring the country, while Evening Moscow newspaper was publishing charged pictures of Chumak on the regular, recommending people hold them to wherever it hurts. In May of 1989, two things converge in China: mass protests and Gorbachev coming over to visit. The first signs of unrest manifested on May 13th, when some students declared a hunger strike on Tiananmen Square in Beijing. Gorbachev arrived to the Chinese capital on May 15th, fully committed to improving the USSR's relationship with China, which was even more complicated at that point than it used to be with the US. The streets of Beijing were awash with protesters who were demanding democratization of the government and freedom of speech. Protests were happening in 20 Chinese cities. Students at the Tiananmen Square refused to hear out the country's leaders Zhao Ziyang and Li Peng. A public emergency was declared in the center of the capital. Gorbachev was negotiating to normalize the border situation, since the USSR had long been having trouble keeping such an enormous army stationed in the Far East. It all came down to Deng Xiaoping's word. Upon meeting with Gorbachev, the father of China's reforms said the following: "Let the wind blow away what has been and let us look into the future." They discussed trade near the border, both sides withdrawing their troops. It seemed as if Gorbachev wasn't noticing the nearby commotion. The students sent him a letter of appeal, but he wasn't looking to meet with them. During the final press conference, he was asked a direct question by journalists about what was going on, but Gorbachev went completely off topic. The question was then repeated, but Gorbachev deflected it again. The living pulse of your country. 2 weeks later, authorities led an operation to clear the city center of protests, sending tanks after college students. After approvingly observing Chinese economic reforms, the world was horrified by their communist regime's cruelty. Western powers put their political contacts with Beijing on ice, and now China was the evil empire. The USSR's official statement was to the effect of extreme actions being unnecessary, though allegedly transitioning from socialism to a market economy without strict guidance leads to chaos. It was either order or democracy. So the student riots, their demands for further liberalization and freedom, they were largely fueled by what was happening in the Soviet Union. The Chinese government had to make a difficult choice. Aside from the communistic dogma, they were standing on thousands of years of history. They were worried that if they'd loosen their grip, China would rapidly destabilize, and the situation would spiral out of control. This resulted in them committing an atrocity. Thousands of people were killed, thousands more sent to prison, dozens were executed. Now, this is a sinful thing to say, but you could argue that these actions are what allowed China to win in the long run. Now they're enjoying stability, rapid economic growth, plus they're increasing their political pluralism. We in the Soviet Union, as well as democratic Western nations, would soon forgive these atrocities. What we shouldn't forget is the heroism of those Chinese students. They were fighting for their freedom, the most valuable thing a person can have. In February of 1989, the world simultaneously learns about British author of Bengalese origin Salman Rushdie, and that he needed to be executed for challenging Islam, the Prophet, and the Quran, as declared by Iran's spiritual leader Khomeini. They put a bounty of $1 million on the author's head. Rushdie's novel *The Satanic Verses* tells about a peddler who became a prophet, obviously alluding to Muhammad. The main protagonist's sins on display and a loose interpretation of ancient legends outraged the Muslim world. Bookstores around the world were being burned, while Khomeini was calling for vengeance. Such words coming from him had already led to 30 people getting killed outside of Iran. What sort of religion can bring itself to do that? What sort of religious leaders are capable of such things? And they say this religion is above any insinuations and criticism. European countries withdrew their ambassadors from Iran. Britain terminated all diplomatic relations with Iran, while providing security for Rushdie, confirming the right of their subject to free speech. Iran was supported by 46 Islamic countries, and the USSR didn't get involved in the scandal, with blasphemy still being foreign to us, not to mention a country taking such care of just one of its citizens. On the night from the 8th to the 9th of April 1989, Transcaucasian district military units and the Dzerzhinsky division stationed near Moscow suppress an illegal rally next to the House of Government on Rustaveli Prospect in Tbilisi, Georgia. 19 people were killed. The first severe damage to Gorbachev's image as a Democrat was done with a spade. He deemed it necessary to remove himself from the police operation. And since then, they'd make the same excuses in all situations of this type. The president is unaware, he was asleep, he was on a trip. On day 1, on April 4th, around 10,000 people gathered at the House of Government. Instigators of this round-the-clock rally included famous dissidents Mirab Kostava and Zviad Gamsahurdia. The Georgian militia didn't dare touch the protesters, and the decision was made to involve the military. At 4:05 a.m., armored vehicles appeared on Rustaveli Prospect. They were moving using the entire width of the street, and immediately after them followed a line of soldiers. The troops stopped between the House of Artists that was across the street and the House of Government's lawn. They then proceeded to push the protesters further down Rustaveli Prospect, towards the Council of Ministers building. They used poisonous gas, and those who fainted, mostly women, were being trampled by the crowd. Soldiers were beating protesters with batons and spades. The rally participants were pursued up until the Telegraph building, which is several blocks away from here. They weren't able to sweep what had happened under the rug. On April 9th, Georgia's Central Committee First Secretary and Prime Minister were forced to resign. General Rodionov, commander of the Transcaucasian district, declared curfew in Tbilisi. The funeral ceremony to honor those who were killed itself turned into a protest. That which was labeled as anti-Soviet attitudes was now more intense in Georgia than even in the Baltic states. Central Committee member, Foreign Affairs Minister Raul Leroy and other officials The main consumer question of 1989 was no longer where you can get something or what's on sale, but rather where did everything go? Even soaps, detergents, grain and pasta had disappeared from stores. They issued stamps for everything, with Moscow being the last city to experience issues with supply. But in 1989, even in Moscow you couldn't get sugar without a stamp. For the rest of the country, sweets were always in limited supply. The sugar crisis was a result of the anti-alcohol campaign, though it wasn't just moonshiners who were buying sacks of sugar. The people were stockpiling any sort of non-perishable produce. Plus, sugar was a replacement for candy that had long been gone. In Moscow, they were selling 4 times more sugar than usual. Moscow's stamp limit was pretty generous, 2 kilos a month per person instead of just 1 like in the periphery, and even 3 in the summer when people were making jam. Serious changes occur in the Russian art scene. Mikhail Shemyakin and Ernst Nezvestny, who left the country in the 70s, spearheaded the effort to bring modern art to the masses. They were the first high-profile figures in post-Soviet art. From then on, emigration made a person's story look better. Turns out that Russian artists were promoting collaboration between our own and Western culture. In America, they had an exotic Russian flair to them, while back home they were seen as social activists. They held an exhibition with Shemyakin's work in Moscow. It was also interesting to see an artist help free prisoners in Afghanistan. Shemyakin would be held in especially high esteem in Leningrad as a muralist sculptor. Neizvestny proposed his own project for the memorial in honor of victims of Stalin's repressions. His palatable avant-garde style made him a darling of the media. People remembered Neizvestny's conflict with Khrushchev and the former prime minister's monument at the Novodevichy cemetery. Meanwhile, the leading Soviet avant-garde artists of the 70s and 80s, Ilya Kabakov, Eric Bulatov, and Grigory Bruskin, they fled the country. Upon becoming head of state, here's how Gorbachev went about reforming the government. The Congress was now the highest governing body that was authorized to examine any and all issues. 750 territorial district deputies, 750 more from national districts, and 750 from public organizations, 100 from the Communist Party, 75 from the Komsomol, and so on, all the way to 1 deputy from the All-Union Stamp Collector Society. Congresses were held twice a year, while a Supreme Soviet selected by the Congress was on constant duty, 20% of it having to be renewed annually. The People's Deputy election in March of 1989, the inaugural USSR People's Deputy Congress in May and June spelled the end for the old system of government, while completely altering the political landscape in the Soviet Union. The whole country was following how the main opposition was being elected. Yeltsin was being nominated by many cities, but he refused even his old hometown Sverdlovsk, instead deciding to campaign in Moscow. The best opponent they could find for him was Brakov, director of the ZIL factory. The Moscow Town Committee's clumsy smear campaign actually aided Yeltsin, with him receiving almost 90% of all votes. A terrible failure for the present government and a personal loss for Gorbachev. Sakharov claimed that he could only become a people's deputy through the Academy of Sciences, where he'd been working for 35 years. One day prior, the heads of the academy refused to nominate Sakharov, despite 60 institutes vouching for him. After some extensive maneuvering, Sakharov was elected, together with a few other liberal scientists. At the very onset of the first Congress, it was clear that the House of Congresses had never seen such a gathering. Moments after it was declared open, Deputy Talpezhnikov from Riga quickly took the stand and demanded everyone honor those who died in Tbilisi. The Congress was obliged to comply. An alternative agenda was offered by Sakharov. A completely unknown deputy named Obolensky insisted that the Supreme Soviet chairman had to be someone else other than Gorbachev, and nominated himself. The deliberately polite Baltic state deputies, mostly nominated by Sayudis and other national movements, stood their ground and repeatedly reminded everyone about the upcoming 50th anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The first People's Deputy Congress was the ultimate rally, with notes, deliberations, speeches amplified by microphones, and involving the country's best people: authors, journalists, scientists, performers. The country was following it on TV, reading the transcripts in newspapers. The country had been waiting for this rally, for interesting conversations as opposed to boring sections of Soviet law. The country wanted to see, and indeed saw, that there were in fact two countries. One was the aforementioned best people, the other, those who voted upon offer from the Presidium. The best folk weren't going to wait for those who fell behind, help them become better, come to terms with them. No, instead they'd move forward and leave them to wallow in their political ignorance, only to express their disgust with them in the end by labeling them as the aggressive and obedient majority. And so you, Mr. Gorbachev, who's carefully listening, you're either carefully listening to that majority, or you're expertly manipulating them. There wasn't a single proposal made by Moscow liberals that actually made it through. The only thing the Congress voted unanimously on was creating a board on the events in Tbilisi, led by a lawyer named Sobchak. The freethinkers were not satisfied with such an outcome and decided to stage a group gathering of inter-regional deputies in the House of Cinema straight after, forming what some called a faction, others opposition in parliament. The inter-regionals selected 5 vice-chairmen: Yuri Afanasyev, Boris Yeltsin, Viktor Palm from the Baltic states, Gavril Popov, Andrei Sakharov. Drawing millions of people into politics who know full well what we're dissatisfied with, who are not yet prepared for what they'll need to do, and are not bound by new economic interests. While presiding at that Congress, Gorbachev displayed his exceptional talent for improvisation, in who to give the floor and not, where in the auditorium to switch on a microphone, manipulating the regulations. His peculiar hand gestures were dubbed political manual therapy. He would act on intuition spontaneously, fumbling words more often than usual. Gorbachev's rhetoric was poked fun at, with how amusing his pronunciation sometimes was when he was speaking of initiating, intensifying, building foundations, mindsets, setting processes into motion, and so on. For many years, strikes were a relic of pre-revolutionary times, or something that had happened in the West, where the working people were fighting for their rights in the heat of a class struggle. But in 1989, the first strikes occurred in the land of developed socialism, where enterprises supposedly belong to the whole of the people, and where factories belong to the working class. That summer, the mining regions were swept by a huge wave of protests with up to 500,000 participating. On July 10th, all operations ceased at the mine in Mezhdurechensk, and in just a week there were strikes happening all over the Kuzbas. The list of demands contained 42 items, including extra pay for evening and night shifts, improving product supply, and so on. On July 18th, authorities agreed to meet all of the protesters' demands. Soon after, there's another strike at the Donbass, involving almost 300,000 people. Then in Komi, Rostov province, Kazakhstan. In Vorkuta, miners were demanding Article 6 of the Constitution on the Communist Party's leading role be abolished. When hearing mining helmets banging on the pavement, when seeing their coal dust-smeared faces, managers of all levels promptly stood down. A new power had emerged in workers' fronts. The miners' strikes of 1989 were the start of socialism's downfall. Under socialism, the government and the economy are inseparable. You need a stringent and efficient government in order for there to be bread in food stores, for homes to have electricity, boilers to have fuel. When the government isn't strict and efficient, when nobody's following their orders, the system starts rapidly collapsing. By 1989, the state of the economy was already dire. The half-baked reforms conducted by Gorbachev and Ryzhkov paid off. The old system was incapacitated. The new market system hadn't taken over yet. Miners were understandably demanding soap to clean themselves off, bread and other produce. They were putting serious pressure onto the government. But the further authorities were backing off, the more unfeasible promises they were making, the more they were willing to compromise, the clearer it became that the strict and efficient government was no more. And in that case, socialism as an economic model begins to topple like a house of cards. All promises given would prove to be bluffs. No actions would be taken. But then there's really nothing you can do in this sort of situation. The downfall of socialism was well underway. Turns out not all was well with Soviet hockey. The star players Fetisov, Larionov, Makarov and Krutov were in a dispute with senior coach of CSK and the Soviet national team Viktor Tikhonov. The players were accusing him of being rude and of dictator-like conduct. Their ultimatum, to the tune of "we no longer want to play for Tikhonov's team," was accompanied by news that they had their sights set on the NHL, where they'd been long awaited. The rebel players explained that people of their professional level shouldn't be stuck in camp for 11 months a year away from their families. Tikhonov's methods were outdated and an outright insult to the players. CSK's players were active servicemen, and prior to leaving the country, they had to retire from the military. Army leadership was all sorts of stubborn. Fetisov was suspended from training, and only thanks to pressure from the team and public opinion was he allowed to go to the World Championship in Sweden, where he was declared the best defensive player. In Sweden, the young and promising offensive player Alexander Mogilny disappeared. He would later resurface in Canada. Apparently realizing that the other players could also run for it, the system officially releases Fetisov, Makarov, Larionov, Krutov, Kasatonov, and Starikov. On the 3rd of June 1989, late at night, in Bashkiria at kilometer post 1710 of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, a horrendous explosion occurred because of gas that leaked from the Nizhnevartovsk-Ufa pipeline. Two trains headed towards each other were caught in the epicenter. One was going from Novosibirsk to Adler, the other from Adler to Novosibirsk. 575 people were killed. 2 cars filled with pioneers headed for the Black Sea were burned to the core. In the hottest spot, people were literally turned into ashes. Around 200 people were injured, spent a long time in shock, unable to even remember their names. And this is what a man named Viktor Bezverky looked like after the disaster, who was the 34-year-old machinist of train number 121. Despite suffering severe burns, he was able to crawl 2.5 miles to the nearest house to report the accident. Investigators learned that the leak was caused by damage that the pipeline sustained when a trench was being dug up. Throughout 4 years of perestroika, the only real shift in terms of civil public activism was that the traditional conversations in the kitchen were touching on articles published in open media. It wasn't until '89 that people started going out onto the streets. Mass protests became the new way for people to express their political views. The first ones took place right before the People's Deputies election, and not many people gathered. During the Congress, they allocated a spot at Luzhniki Stadium specifically for rallies, which took place daily after proceedings were over and attracted up to 100,000 people. The crowd moving in from Sportivnia subway station gave the impression that a crucial game was underway. Speeches were given by the likes of Sakharov, Yeltsin, Gdulyan, Popov, Zaslavsky. Protests were the primary means of mobilizing constituency. Everybody unconditionally supported Moscow's deputies and expressed their solidarity with the Baltic nations. In 1989, TV audiences based in the European region were now able to tune into programs from Leningrad. Alexander Nevzorov was universally praised as the creator and host of a daily news program called 600 Seconds. Meanwhile, Fifth Wheel introduced Russian viewers to a new genre, video channel, which was a blending of diverse video material. Hello, one recent event that's undoubtedly of great importance is the release of... Being the gifted reporter that he was, Nevzorov squeezed tons of information into a 10-minute window. He would report on blood-curdling news with a completely deadpan face and ironic delivery. He was the first to run reports from prison cells and morgues, to showcase homeless bums and mentally ill folks. He wasn't afraid to criticize anyone, and the program would be sued up to 24 times a month. Nevzorov was tremendously popular. In 1989, he was up there with Sobchak as Leningrad's most famous resident. Fifth Wheel was the perestroika-era intellectuals' favorite program. Video channel material wasn't necessarily structured, simply offering 3 hours of material that was worth watching. It is incredibly fortunate that we can now implement and unveil that which is inherent to each one of us. Fifth Wheel aired the first ever interview with Andrei Sakharov, the first recordings of rallies staged by Democrats and the Memory Society. They screened alternative movies. Investigators Gtlian and Ivanov spoke of Middle Asian buys in the Communist Party ranks, while two Sergeys, Kuryokhin and Sholokov, let viewers in on the fact that Lenin was a mushroom. You see, the October Revolution was orchestrated by folks who for many years consumed certain mushrooms. And while these mushrooms were being consumed by them, they were slowly replacing their personalities, effectively turning them into mushrooms. To put it simply, I'm trying to say that Lenin was a mushroom. In 1989, they start running commercials on Soviet TV. Lengthy ads of up to a minute casually inform viewers on products made by cooperatives, while giving out telephones and addresses. Starring Tom Hanks.
I gotta pee.
I believe he said he had to go pee.
Up until that time, the term hotspots would bear the adage, around the planet. Starting in 1989, the map of the USSR would indicate hotspots wherever there were ethnic conflicts occurring in the periphery. Moscow sends domestic security forces to several regions of the country, while looking for places to settle thousands of refugees. The situation in the Fergana Valley in Uzbekistan continues to be incredibly volatile. Our reporters are currently on the spot. Riots broke out in Fergana. Animosity between Uzbeks and Meskhetian Turks that moved into the area in 1944 grew into a full-out massacre with dozens of victims. Guarded refugee camps were set up in fields, and from there military planes would carry people into central Russia. Next stop, Novy Uzen in Kazakhstan, where civilians were clashing with Caucasian merchants. It took deploying troops and instating curfew to put an end to the bloodshed. In short time, Sukhumi, Zugdidi, Baku, Dushanbe, Osh Province, Dubasari, and Southern Ossetia were added to the list of hotspots. Prior to 1989, it might have seemed as if there were attempts within the socialist bloc to at least keep up with the Soviet perestroika, when they'd greet the trailblazers with edgy slogans like, "Together with Gorbachev, we stand against Gusak," like they did in Prague. From summer and until the end of 1989, regimes were toppling one after another. Old party leaders were being replaced by local Gorbachevs, or even leaders who weren't communists, skipping that interim stage altogether. Eastern European countries were going through even more rapid change than their big brother. Hungary's divorce from socialism was painless. The reigning party sat down to negotiate with the opposition and worked out a deal to radically revamp the political system. The word "peoples" was dropped from the country's name, leaving just Republic of Hungary. A referendum was held to determine how to conduct parliamentary and presidential elections. After the election held under new rules, most chairs in the Polish Sejm were now held by the opposition. And though the Sejm chose Jaruzelski as the country's president, he was forced to appoint a member of Solidarity as head of the cabinet. Tadeusz Mazowiecki became the first non-communist prime minister in what used to be the socialist bloc. Czechoslovakia turned out to be a romanticized symbol of freedom. That country went through what was called a Velvet Revolution. It all began with an illegal student march towards the center of Prague. The Velvet Revolution might have been the most delicate one in history, more plush even than velvet, symbolized by a horn sign like you'd see at a rock concert. The situation was long demanding some kind of resolution. It was November, and East Germans were fleeing to the west through Czechoslovakia as early as in the summer. Protesters were en route to the Prague castle. They were stopped by armored vehicles that left a side alley for them to escape. The protesters were urged to turn left. The crowd's reply was, "We will never again turn to the left." Every day, Wenceslas Square hosted political protests. Czechoslovakia's most famous dissident, playwright Václav Havel, announces the founding of an opposition movement called Civic Forum. Alexander Dubček, who spearheaded the Prague Spring of 1968, returns from his exile in Slovakia. Havel won the early presidential election. The victory of a well-known entrepreneur's son was a dream come true that gave hope of returning to how things used to be. The president in his sweater was the new face of Eastern Europe. Dubček would become chairman of Czechoslovakia's parliament. Meanwhile, in Bulgaria, Todor Zhivkov's lame dictatorship crumbles. The best friend of the Soviet Union, who had been head of the Sunny Republic for precisely 33 years, was sentenced to house arrest. The most dramatic situation unfolded in Romania, which was run by the family of the grim dictator Ceausescu. As soon as the civil unrest emanating from the periphery reached Bucharest, the Securitate agency was given orders to open fire at any living thing. Even kids going home from the puppet theater were caught in the gunfire. The fighting continued even after they apprehended Ceausescu and his wife, who were trying to escape from the city. Count Dracula of the Socialist Bloc, who had been universally loathed for a long time, his rushed trial and execution by the rebels seemed to be the only way it could have ended. For almost 30 years, the concrete Berlin Wall was the literal manifestation of the Iron Curtain, dividing the city into the capital of East Germany and the Western sector. It embodied the rift in Europe, just like the division of Germany itself. The history of two Germanys was all about East German citizens attempting to escape to West Germany. From May of 1989, mass exodus began via the embassy, the Czechoslovakian West German border, the Austrian-Hungarian border. On October 18th, long-standing First Secretary Erich Honecker resigned from his post. As late as January, he was insisting that the wall would stand for 50 and even 100 years. On November 9th at 5 p.m. local time, East German television issued a message. Free passage to West Berlin will soon be opened. Thousands of people rushed towards the wall. Appropriately, the wall being peacefully stormed was a symbol of Berlin, Germany, and Europe uniting once again. Reports from the main bastion of socialism make history on that very same night. The next morning, nobody was going over the wall. Instead, they'd opened 18 new checkpoints. Throughout the first 2 weeks of simplified border crossing procedures, 10 million people would apply for a travel visa to visit West Germany, or East Germany's entire adult population. By Christmas, visas were abolished altogether. The wall was 27 miles long within city limits and 70 counting by West Berlin's outer rim, all for a total of 97 miles. The pedantic Germans later counted the number of bulldozers, cranes, excavators, and dump trucks used to demolish the wall: 40, 65, 55, and 90 respectively. However, the leaders of two superpowers agreed on the need for more active dialogue. On December 14, 1989, Andrei Sakharov died unexpectedly at age 68 from a heart attack. He was giving a speech that day at the Interregional Group meeting, speaking on the need for the opposition to officially acknowledge the interregionals. When he got back home, he continued to work on a constitution for the Union of Soviet Republics of Europe and Asia. Then he said to his wife that tomorrow there will be a battle and went to bed. Sakharov's untimely death shocked the severely politicized Soviet society. For the first time, the divide in the Politburo ranks was registered in protocol. The obituary published in Pravda was signed by Gorbachev and Yakovlev, but not by Ligachev. Memorial ceremonies were held at the Palace of Youth, next to the Academy of Sciences Presidium's old building, and the Physics Institute where he used to work. The civil funeral at Luzhniki Stadium was reminiscent of an opposition rally. The portrait of the deceased was set next to crossed-out sixes, symbolizing the repealing of Constitution Article 6 on the Communist Party's leading role, the best possible contribution on behalf of the interregionals. The scale of the memorial services made political opponents very uncomfortable. It was at that moment a saying appeared. Although I didn't necessarily agree with Sakharov's opinion on certain matters, but I've always respected the caliber of his person. At the end of every year he was in power, Gorbachev would leave the country to meet with the US president. In 85, 86, 87, and 88 he met with Reagan, but in December of 1989, Gorbachev flew to Malta for a meeting with George Bush, the new president and an old acquaintance. Before that he was in Italy, where he visited the Vatican and had a chat with the Pope. He was our first ever national leader to do so, and that's including pre-Soviet history. Old Navy cadets made it onto TV screens. In creating an image of historical Russian supermen, screenwriters Nina Sirotkina and Yuri Nagibin, with director Svetlana Druzhinina, reimagined the French Musketeers. Viewers were calling Naval Cadets Charge the best TV film for 2 years in a row. The only thing carried over from the old Musketeer movie was Boyarsky, who was passionate, Frenchy, and charming as always, albeit he was playing the bad guy. The main protagonists were navigation school graduates, played by Vladimir Shevelkov, Sergei Zhigunov, and Dmitry Karatyan. They were motivated to carry on by the lyrics, "Keep your chins up, naval cadets." The rare situation when the sex symbols were blonde-haired, 4 episodes of adventures, rapiers, and 18th century-styled sets, with a political subplot and lengthy romantic sidetracks. Not the wallet, but the mind. And that was 1989 in our show The Other Day, 1961 to 1991 current era. Events, people, and occurrences that defined a lifestyle. Next year is 1990. The events in Baku, commercial radio stations, the Lambada, Popov and Sobchak, You Can't Live Like That, United Germany, Alexei II, Mitki, the RSFSR Communist Party, the 500-day program, TSN, and the Russian Wheel of Fortune. See you for a new episode and a new year. Farewell.